This is Ian, testing 1, 2.
Good afternoon, everyone. We'll just get started in a few moments. We just have some more people signing on as we speak. So in just a few minutes, we'll be underway. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon for Ontario One Call's webinar in regards to Bill 93, the Getting Ontario Connected Act of 2022. We'll just start with some housekeeping matters. One very important one. A number of you registered through a link Ian Simpson, our Director of Marketing and Education, sent to you. Because you clicked on the link, you're actually considered organizers of this webinar, and as such, you have incredible powers, such as the ability to suddenly end the webinar for everyone. So I would ask you, if you have to leave the webinar, do not touch the close webinar for all button, otherwise you'll end it for everyone. I would also ask all participants to make sure they are on mute. We will be doing questions, and I'll talk about how we're going to submit questions in a few moments. But everyone, just make sure that you are on mute for the presentation. So just to give an overview, and I'll be giving an overview of Bill 93 and its various components. Bill 93 is the first and certainly the largest set of amendments to Ontario One Call since the legislation was passed in 2012. There were some very minor changes that came from the Broadband Act, Bill 257, which we'll probably refer to later in this meeting. But this is the first time that there's been a fundamental review of the legislation. And as such, there are changes to a number of areas, including operational performance, compliance, and Ontario One Call governance. So we're going to review all of those topics in some detail. My objective here is to take your understanding of the Act, if not from 0 to 100, from at least 0 to 60. So I want everyone to have a good understanding of the legislation once we've completed our time here together. So for the first slide, the webinar overview, we'll just start with some of the operational aspects. So you do have the ability to ask questions using the question mark feature in the top right of your screen. I would ask you that you hold off on your questions until we're actually reviewing that topic during the presentation. So when I'm on the slides talking about Dedicated Locator, that's the time to ask questions around Dedicated Locator. If you have a question about, for example, the Ontario One Call governance, don't ask those questions during the Dedicated Locator slides. We won't be able to sort through those questions. I should also emphasize too that there are a very large number of participants. We crossed over 700 just before we turned the webinar live, and we do have 2,000 RSVPs. So if you've been on smaller webinars where we've had maybe 100, 150 participants, this is actually many multiples of that. So it's going to be a very busy webinar, but one that I hope will add a lot of value to your afternoon. And in terms of the questions to ask, the emphasis should be on questions directly relating to the Act, in particular, how the Act works or what the Act means. There's obviously going to be a temptation to go into some level of detail about, for example, how you'd operationalize very specific things. We can leave that for another day, but this is just about the Act, what's in it, and the topics that it covers. In terms of after this webinar, you decide you want to provide feedback, give input to the government, who should you contact? There is a link, and this presentation will be posted on the Ontario One Call website. There is a link to the regulatory registry where you can post comments, or you can write the Ministry of Government and Consumer Services directly with your feedback. Just to make sure everyone's, make sure you're on mute as well. In terms of this presentation, this was developed by Ontario One Call. There may be different views amongst members, excavators, stakeholders. This is to provide an overall view of where we view things as. So different people will have different views and different opinions, but this is just to give you an overview of the scenario. And just to make sure everyone, please make sure that you are on mute. We don't want to hear any background noise. Sorry, we just had a brief technical delay there. So in terms of the next slide, topics to cover, we're going to cover a lot of ground today. During the presentation, I'll stop it a number of times to answer questions that you pose through the question feature on those specific topics. But this is the agenda we have today. So I'll quickly review the origins of the legislation and locate solutions working group. I'll try to get through that quickly, and we won't take any questions on that, just so we get to the meat of the agenda as soon as we can. So the meat of the agenda is an overview of the legislation, looking at dedicated locator, operational items, compliance, and Ontario One Call governance, and also taking some time to look beyond the legislation to talk about the Dedicated Locator Working Committee, which will be a very important body going forward, and the implications for members, excavators, Ontario One Call, and also next steps going forward. So just quickly on the origins of the legislation, why is the government introducing Bill 93 at this point, and what all went into the lead up to this moment? As all of us know, whether you're an excavator, a member, or a stakeholder, there have been continued challenges with late locates across Ontario. And this has spanned for a number of years in all regions of the province and has a lot of root causes to it. Everything from staffing to increasing workloads to the nature of the industry itself. A lot of reasons go into that, but it has been a sustained challenge for a long time. Excavator groups have also come forward with their concerns around the impact of late locates, and they've made strong representations to government and local government as well about how late locates impacts their ability to do their work on time, expose them to the risks of liquidated damages, and generally impacts construction in Ontario. The provincial government, for their part, has been focused on a number of major infrastructure projects, such as broadband access and transit. And as such, as a government has spent more time focusing and funding these projects, they increasingly see themselves in the shoes of the excavators. They wonder if late locates will cause an impact on their costs and their timelines. And obviously, they've become more focused on the risks created by late locates. In this context, the board and the operations committee of Ontario One Call have thought a lot about these issues. And their view has been that, yes, we definitely need to improve late locates in Ontario, but we also have to think about how we want to go about that. So there have definitely been a lot of voices, stay on the previous slide, Corey. Definitely a lot of voices have been saying we need tougher compliance, and compliance will get us to where we're going to go. The board and the ops committee have said, yes, compliance needs to be part of the solution, but we also need to match that with operational improvements that remove barriers in the industry to timely locate delivery. So what's really been communicated from the board and from the operations committee, and I think you'll see in this presentation, is that we really need to marry operational improvements alongside the compliance improvements. On the next slide, I'll talk about the big initiative that the board and the operations committee undertook to bring those two ideas together, and also to provide a lot of feedback and content that the government could consider in terms of considering solutions for late locate delivery. A group called the Locate Solutions Working Group was formed late last year to provide input and develop sustainable solutions to improve locates, both in the short term and in the long term. Their job was to look at the current state issues, to look at some preliminary solutions, both operational and compliance, and to recommend improvements that could be implemented to improve the end-to-end utility locate process. And they were designed and facilitated to create greater alignment between members and excavators and stakeholders to really work out shared solutions and win-win scenarios. So it was a real collaborative and collective effort. On the next slide, you see some of the participants. And this isn't necessarily the full list. There were other people who came in as the sessions continued. But you can see it was a variety of people. We had some representatives from Ontario One Call and its board. We had officials from the government, the Ministry of Government and Consumer Services, as well as Infrastructure Ontario, as well as the Ministry of Infrastructure, LSPs, excavator groups, One Call members, and stakeholder and technical representatives as well. So we brought together a diverse group of people to really examine the issues from every dimension. And in terms of the 6 sessions that we held, you can see on the next slide how we went about our work. So over these 6 sessions during November and December of 2021, we reviewed the current situation, scoped solutions, went into depth on the dedicated locator model, which was a topic of great interest to all participants, looked into the definition of a project, and reviewed proposed legislative enhancement to the Ontario One Call Act, and then concluded it with a next steps review. So from all this work came consensus around 27 recommendations which emerged from the sessions. Many of these, but not necessarily all of these, appear in Bill 93, and I'll point them out as we go along. There are still some other items that are still going to be worked on by the Ontario One Call Operations Committee and Ontario One Call staff. Some are shorter term things that can be achieved in the next few months. Others are longer term initiatives. So in terms of the 27 recommendations, and I won't dwell too much on this, the first set relate to recommendations for the legislative track. And I'll just run through them very quickly. Project locates must be completed by certified locators, mandatory 360 feedback participation, one call to issue monetary penalties against non-compliant members, a lot of discussion around dedicated locator and defining terms that currently are in the bylaws that should exist in the legislation, an interest in including excavators under some of the compliance provisions in the Act. That was included, and we'll talk about that in some detail. And also the role of One Call in implementing compliance and enforcement policies, and then publicizing the outcomes in terms of members' performance and convictions on the website. A few others that fall into this legislative track: project proponents being able to seek damages from members. That is included in the legislation. Again, we'll talk about that in some detail. Financial penalties for not using 360 feedback. Obligation for members to share information with dedicated locators. And dedicated locators is a major part of Bill 93. And digital mapping standards, which is an important issue, not one that's in Bill 93, but an example of something that'll be continued in terms of the work of the One Call Operations Committee. There's also a set of recommendations that are outside of the scope of legislation. These are more technical or IT related items. So establishing the minimum set of criteria for an actionable locate request, how would the Ontario One Call system allow the input of those types of requests? Mandatory virtual site meets, that was another area of interest. Not something that needs to be included in legislation, but it is an interesting idea to examine. And other things that fall under what you might call technical amendments, how excavators are able to request remarks. What schedule can we add to outline the requirements and obligations of excavators? In our bylaws, we can create a code of conduct applicable to all parties. These are things that the Ops Committee will continue to pursue, but aren't really the type of thing you would include in legislation. So those are the 27 recommendations. Again, many are included in Bill 93, and the other set will be included in the ongoing work of the Operations Committee. So getting into Bill 93 specifically. So we're now going to start the part of the presentation where if you have questions in terms of what's on the screen, now's a good time to hit the question button and ask them. And at the end of certain sections, I'll stop and pause and ask Ian Simpson and Adam Morden from Ontario One Call, who are moderating the question room, to pose some questions that you guys have posed that I will answer. So as we get into Bill 93, we have to look at some new terms that have been created by this legislation. There's 5 of them here. There's some other terms in there, but these are the most important ones. The concept of project owner is introduced in this legislation. And under the law, the project are a variety of contractors who are doing work on their behalf. In a municipality doing, let's say they're installing new water mains, the municipality would be the project owner, and they would contract that work out to the excavator. So in this universe, you have a project owner who initiates the project and an excavator who actually does the construction work. And you'll see the importance of the difference between those two parties as we go along. Dedicated locator, we'll discuss the concept and the terms in some detail, but I know a lot of people have different views about what dedicated locator is or how it should work or how it could work. This legislation creates a pretty specific definition of what is and is not included in dedicated locator. So there's a lot of discrepancies and differences in terms of what dedicated locator should mean. Bill 93 will provide a definitive answer in terms of what a dedicated locator is. There is the concept of an assessor. An assessor is essentially a compliance person at Ontario One Call who's authorized to levy penalties against members and excavators. So once we get to the compliance section, you'll start to see that word assessor. That is a reference to Ontario One Call compliance staff who are so designated. The Ontario Land Tribunal is not a new concept. It's existed for a long time, best known as the Ontario Municipal Board. But Ontario Land Tribunal actually plays a role in some of the compliance aspects. So it's a pretty novel approach by the government, but OLT is an acronym that you should be aware of in terms of looking at Bill 93. And the appeals body. In compliance, we'll discuss a process by which members and excavators can appeal a decision of the assessor to an appeals body. The appeals body will be determined by a minister's regulation. It's likely to be some form of binding arbitration, but the concept of appeals body is something new that is created in Bill 93. So these are all new terms that have been created by this act. On the next slide, we're going to talk about dedicated locator. And we're going to do 2 slides on dedicated locator, and then we'll pause for questions just about dedicated locator. So currently, we see a fair bit of use of dedicated locator on a voluntary basis, most often with major projects like broadband, where an excavator who is doing a major project at great vulnerability of delays due to late locates contracts to hire the dedicated locator with the approval of members in order to better control that resource. And in that circumstance, the excavator is the one paying for the designated locator. That's typically the way it works. There's some different iterations of that, but that's the most typical approach. Bill 93 describes something that's much broader, much more specific, and something that really opens the door for new possibilities and new opportunities. So in reviewing these slides, I want everyone to think in a very open-minded way, because a lot of you, your eyes might get a little wide when you think about what could be possible with this legislation. So these are the key aspects of designated locator. And as always, I will urge you to look at the act itself to get the most full understanding of it, but these are the key parts. Who can use designated locator? The government has assigned, in this act, designated broadband projects will be using dedicated locator. So right now, some do, some don't. Under Bill 93, all the designated broadband projects will use it. Also, any projects designated by the minister, that gives the Minister of Government and Consumer Services the power to say, okay, these major transit projects like the Ontario line in Toronto, those are going to be added to dedicated locator. So the minister has the option to include projects or cohorts of work or entire types of work in dedicated locator as well. So that really expands the idea of what's possible. It is possible to think that all the major transit projects could go to dedicated locator. That would actually be made that, just to take random examples, that major sewer work should be done through dedicated locator, and the minister could make a regulation to that effect. So it really opens up the possibilities of what could be done under dedicated locator. The legislation also says any excavation or dig project or the project owner chooses to use a dedicated locator. So this is important as well. This allows the project owner to say, okay, we want to use dedicated locator for all our work. So if a certain municipality, for example, says, for our sewer and water main work, we want that to be done through dedicated locator, they have the option to do it. And in doing so, under the Act, all members must cooperate and comply in very specific timelines. And we'll talk about that in a few moments. But generally, dedicated locator in this Act is created with pretty broad opportunities, but members must participate. Members do not have the option to decline from dedicated locator. They must participate when done so, when they've been approached by any of these three criteria with designated locator. Who pays for designated locator? Dedicated locator. This was a key part of the discussions. The law states very clearly the project owners pay for dedicated locators. That means, and taking IO as an example, for Infrastructure Ontario's projects related to broadband where they have a variety of subcontractors, those subcontractors will not be stuck with the bill for dedicated locator. The bill will go to Infrastructure Ontario. It could work out that there's some process by which Infrastructure Ontario would want the excavators billed and then IO would reimburse the excavators, but the law is very clear that excavators will not be stuck with a dedicated locator bill. It will be paid by the project owner. There are obligations on the project owner as well. The project owner must provide 90 days notice and must provide rolling quarterly updates.
Second job in where's that job? Bradford?
Sorry, I think someone's off mute.
In addition to community center.
So project owners must provide 90 days notice, and there will be rolling quarterly updates in a format required by Ontario One Call. On the next slide, selection of dedicated locator. So when a project owner comes forward and tells the members that either they're obliged to use dedicated locator or they wish to use dedicated locator, the affected members and project owners shall agree in writing on the dedicated locator within 10 days. Now, One Call is setting up procedures where there'll be much more notice and much more opportunity for this to be done well in advance, so you don't really face a 10-day notice period. But the key point is that the affected members must work together with the project owners, and the members must provide their mapping information and any other information required for the dedicated locator's purposes. So again, I have to stress this very strongly. Members must participate in the dedicated locator model. They must work with project owners to ensure that entities that come forward are certified, and they can't unreasonably withhold permission from that. So again, members are compelled to cooperate and participate in the dedicated locator model. We'll talk a little bit about what that looks like, what kind of procedures will be put in place when we talk about the dedicated locator working committee. I know a lot of you will have very practical and obvious questions about how this is going to work. Hold on to those questions. We're going to answer them later in the presentation. And also obligations of the dedicated locator. Locates must be completed within 10 business days. Practically speaking, a dedicated locator is only going to submit requests the same day they need them. So there's no reason to think that this wouldn't be done on a reliable basis. But other than that, all of the obligations of the dedicated locator are exactly the same as currently exist. A dedicated locator must submit ticket requests to Ontario One Call. Members will get notified. The only difference is that with dedicated locator, the requests will be routed to the dedicated locator directly. And the dedicated locator, because they have the mapping and records and have been certified by the members, will just go ahead and do the locate. So in a lot of ways, it's very similar in terms of the actual process of submitting locates and completing locates. And of course, the dedicated locator is obliged to report through the 360 feedback tool, so there'll also be a record of when the locate is completed. So that's an overview of dedicated locator as it exists in the statute. So let me stop now and ask Ian and Adam to pose any questions. If you wish to ask any questions on dedicated locator, I often use the two phrases. Click on the question button on the top right of your screen and ask away. But I'll turn it over to Ian and Adam to ask some questions. Hold on a second. We're just going to have to take a moment just to make sure they are unmuted. So if we can just pause for a few moments.
Hi, Ben. This is Ian. I'll do the first questions here. Apologize for having a bit of technical difficulty. Just questions about dedicated locator. Just on who is actually allowed to use it. Does this mean that every excavator has the potential of using a dedicated locator?
Pretty much the way the legislation is written, the doors are wide open in terms of who can use designated locator. So we've been approached previously by excavators who want to use it for all their work, big and small. We've been approached by industry associations wondering if it could apply to their entire industry. The answer is generally yes. The way Bill 93 is written, it is very broad and permissive in terms of what excavators could use it for and when they could use it.
I have another question here, Ben. There's a lot of questions about how the operations will go about, like how dedicated locators will be chosen, how it will work. Is there anything you could just address right now about the group working on that?
Sure. So just to leap ahead in the presentation, we're going to be talking about a group that's just been formed and is actually going to have its first meeting next Thursday, which is the Dedicated Locator Working Committee. And the Dedicated Locator Working Committee is a group of members, excavators, and stakeholders, including LSPs, and they're going to develop these specific practices and policies around how dedicated locator will work. So their first two tasks, for example, and these are probably questions that a lot of you are thinking about on the call, who can be a dedicated locator? Who can qualify for that? So obviously there's some major locator providers in Ontario. They could qualify, but what about smaller companies that do private locates? How would they be certified? What if a member or an industry wants to certify their own employees to do it? What if a number of excavating companies want to form a separate company to provide it to a whole industry or group of companies? So the first task of this committee will be to develop standards and a certification process for new locating resources to be certified. So based on a lot of existing contracts, a lot of members have already done the legwork in terms of saying, if company X is going to do locates for us, what kind of training do they have to do? What kind of insurance do they need? What kind of QA work do they have to do? That committee will develop a standardized model that all members can use to help certify new locating resources. Another task they're working on is determining, well, if a project owner has to provide 90 days notice, what does that 90 days notice look like? What information needs to be provided? What level of detail is appropriate? How many specifics need to be included? Basically determining how much information does a project owner need to provide in advance. So those are just two examples of the kinds of questions this committee is going to be working on. And as we go forward, they'll help develop all the policies and procedures that probably a lot of people are asking questions about. So there is a group, and they're certainly going to be working very hard over the next several months to really develop tools that members and excavators can use to help jumpstart the dedicated locator model. And the key thing with the dedicated locator model, there's a lot of key points to it. From one call's perspective and our board's perspective, one of the key things is to increase the number and supply of certified locators in Ontario. The biggest challenge we have right now is that there's a relatively small universe of companies who provide locating services and a relatively small pool of people who are able and certified to do locates. We very explicitly want to grow the supply of locators in Ontario. We want new market participants to come forward. We want excavating companies to come forward with new ideas and new opportunities for entities which will hire, train, and employ locators. And I know from the members' part, they're very committed to ensuring that they're holding up their end of the bargain to ensure that new locating resources can be trained and can be certified. So across the industry, there's a strong desire to increase the supply of locators and make sure that there are enough people in Ontario trained and certified to do the work that needs to be done.
Thank you, Ben. You answered quite a few other questions that are being asked right now. There's a couple other ones that got in here that you might be to help with. There's a couple questions about what does project owner mean in the new bill or act, and what is the real definition for a dedicated locator?
So if you go into the act, and if you don't have a copy of the act, I encourage you to download it. I know it was circulated previously through some of our previous communications. And certainly because I know a lot of people in this call are the frontline operational people. It's definitely important to speak to other people in your organization. So if you have a legal department, definitely speak to your legal department, to your senior administrators, to people who are involved in the day-to-day legal stuff. There's a lot of very complex stuff in here, and it's worth going over in some detail. And if you have questions, certainly we're here to help you. I know the ministry is here to help you as well. You'll find the definitions on page 5 of the Act. So basically, a dedicated locator means what it says in section 7.7a, or sorry, section 7. So basically, page 7 and 8 is a full page definition about what a dedicated locator is. And a project owner talks about an excavator who has or will have charge, management, or control of the project, or in the case of designated broadband project, is the proponent of the project. So in terms of how this is understood amongst government and Ontario One Call, if there's an entity which is funding the project, so typically a municipality for water work, a gas utility for gas pipelines, an electric utility for electricity vaults, that entity is the project owner. And later on, we'll talk about the members, but for a lot of members who might be on this call thinking about their day-to-day locate responsibilities, there's also in another part of your business, a new role that you play as a project owner. So if you're Enbridge, you're thinking, well, I have to provide locates and that's something I do. But Enbridge will also become a project owner potentially for some of this work that it does through designated locators. So project owner is really a new hat that a lot of our members will be wearing, and we'll be communicating to members over the coming months about what that means in terms of a member's responsibilities under designated locator when they're the project owner. But page 5 has those definitions.
Fantastic. Another question if we have time, Ben. There's a question about when a dedicated locator is assigned or chosen, is that sole locator responsible to mark every single utility for that project?
Correct. So once a dedicated locator has been selected between the members and the project owner, the member sends all of their records. All the individual members must send their records to that one dedicated locator.
Great. And then I just have another question here. Just there's a little bit of confusion on a designated project. So a designated broadband project, is there ever an option for them not to use dedicated, or if they're designated, do they have to use a dedicated model?
Under the Act, So for example, section 7 on page 7.1, this section applies with respect to the following excavation or dig projects: a designated broadband project, period. Now, the designated broadband projects are a very specific cohort of projects funded by IO. So there may be broadband projects which are outside of that. The designated broadband projects have a very specific meaning under the Broadband Act, Bill 257. So it's not necessarily covering every broadband project across Ontario, some of which have nothing to do with Infrastructure Ontario.
There is a lot of questions about how dedicated locators will be chosen and how one can be certified, and if it's province-wide. I know you already addressed that, Ben, that there will be a working group to go over those initiatives.
Correct. So the working group will answer a lot of those questions. So we want to provide a process or a template that can be easily adapted by members to say, okay, you want to do locates? This is the standard agreement. So you must meet these qualifications, you must have this level of training, you must have this amount of insurance, and here are the technical aspects of how we do our locates. I know for members that'll come with varying levels of comfort. A lot of members, depending on their risk profile and the quality of their records and even their organizational culture, might feel relatively comfortable having another party do their locates. They may already outsource their locates. The designated locators being used might well be their current provider, so they'd have no issue in any case. A lot of other members may do locates themselves. They may culturally not think it's a comfortable idea to let someone else do your locates. And you might also have concerns over the quality of your records and the ability of an external party to understand the documentation you have. That's why we want to develop a standardized agreement that'll help members navigate that process and ensure that they can utilize dedicated locator as members and still be comfortable that their policies and procedures are being followed. In Ontario, we've had the Locate Alliance Consortium for quite a while, and they're a mix of mostly large entities, but very diverse ones. So they have gas utilities, they have municipalities who have water infrastructure, they have electric utilities. So a lot of these challenges around using a shared locator have been thought through already. And through the Locate Alliance Consortium, they've developed processes where all these diverse members have been able to agree contracts with the same provider that allow all their infrastructure to be located, regardless of the type of infrastructure or the nature of the records they have. So it's a way in which we can bring together diverse members and create a comfort level with that. So that's one big task the Dedicated Locator Working Committee will work on.
That's great, Ben. I have a couple more questions before you move on, if that's okay. There are a lot of questions here, just so everyone, there's a lot of questions coming in. If we can't get to it now, we will try to answer as many as we can online in the following week. One question here is, if this was to pass, how quickly would the Dedicated Locator program start, or what's the official start date?
So don't quote me on this because it's the kind of thing that you have to examine in great detail with your legal counsel. The very last line of the Act, which is page 13, you can see it says, except by otherwise provided in this section, this schedule comes into force the day the Getting Ontario Connected Act 2022 receives royal assent. Pretty much everything in this Act will be in place once the legislation passes and once it receives royal assent. You know, I can't presume to know the mind of the legislature, but this legislation is on track for it to pass in the next month or so, and royal assent typically falls within a couple of days after that. So it's very likely that most of the provisions of Bill 93 will be in effect by this spring. There's a couple of very specific sections that will come into force later. I can't really identify those right offhand. You have to spend a little time sorting through the document. But by and large, everything will take effect right away. So above all, I want to encourage everyone to have a lot of urgency in terms of looking at this document. These are changes coming right away. So if you have something to say to the government, if you want to advocate for changes, there's a very limited window of opportunity to do that. And if you're also excited by a lot of these changes, it's important you start to think about those and consider those right away, because the door will be open for a lot of positive change coming very, very soon.
Great, and I'm going to mix two questions together here, Ben, because it has to deal with compliance for Dedicated Locator. Someone said when they were reading through the Act, they saw a number of timelines for Dedicated Locator, like a 10 business day completion. Does that mean if they fall outside of that, is that a compliance issue? Are they breaching the Act? And number two, if that Dedicated Locator does fall behind, does that mean it's responsibility of the member to get it done?
Good question. I'll try to answer it as best I can. Yes, the time frames apply to Dedicated Locator in terms of 10 business days. That is something that could be enforced through compliance. More practically, the Dedicated Locator is working for the project owner. This is a big feature of Dedicated Locator. The Dedicated Locator works for the project owner and is contracted to the project owner. And as such, you would imagine that there'll be provisions in the contract that will address the impacts of late locates. So it's the obligation of the project owner and the Dedicated Locator to make sure that the Dedicated Locator is properly resourced to do that amount of work. That's one reason we have the mandatory 90-day notice, is to make sure that the project owner is providing that information to the Dedicated Locator. So I imagine practically any kind of dispute or conflict or lateness between a Dedicated Locator and a project owner will be dealt with in their contract and not through Ontario One Call compliance. And in terms of late locates and Designated Locator, because the Designated Locator is submitting requests to Ontario One Call and essentially having One Call system routed back to themselves, it's unlikely that a Designated Locator would submit locate requests until the day they actually need them. So there'd be no reason for a Dedicated Locator to put in a request, 2 weeks before, when they already have all the records that they need, and they would just be sending themselves a notification unnecessarily early. So the reality is, I don't think there'd be many locates that a Dedicated Locator would do that would have a time frame of completion greater than a day, because they already have the records. They don't have to wait for anything from the members. They already have all the information. So they're just going to submit it the same time they need it. So I think in practicality, once we start to run reports about Designated Locator, we're going to see that pretty much every locate was ordered and completed the same day.
Great, and just one more question here, Ben, before you move on. There's a question about the validity period of Dedicated Locator, because they've noticed that in the Act, there's reference to an extended validity period for members. If a Dedicated Locator locates, does that validity period also include what they provide?
Yes, that's my understanding. And that's actually a good segue to our next slide, which is operational items. And as we discussed, the vision of the One Call board and the One Call operations committee was to marry operational improvements with compliance improvements. Dedicated Locator definitely opens up a lot of operational opportunities, and I think a lot of you are, furiously thinking about some of those benefits and how they can be managed and worked on. But there are a lot more operational items included as well. So the validity period, as was just mentioned, will now be a minimum of 60 days. It can be longer if you so choose. I know a lot of members have longer periods or indefinite periods for the life of the project, but locate validity periods must be a minimum of 60 days. And this was put in by the government to avoid an issue we see quite frequently at One Call, which is differing expiration times and literally locates expiring before some locates have actually been delivered. So there was a strong view amongst excavators that this should be established at a minimum of 60 days. For some members, I know that's a change. You might have a 30-day limit. The law will now state it has to be 60 days. Nothing prevents you from relocating it every day if you so choose, but the validity period on each locate must be 60 days. Locate sharing is something that we've been working on at One Call through our operations committee. Locate sharing is now explicitly allowed, and there's actually a lot of language in Bill 93 about how that happens. So if you have questions about how that works, it's all laid out in some detail in the law. Ticket dumping is prohibited. You may not enter a ticket for work beginning more than 30 days in the future. That was part of the previous act, it is also part of this act. Standard and emergency locate requests are included. Previously, they were in the bylaws for the most part. All of that language is now going to be in the act itself. We did have a discussion about priority locates. They will not be part of the law. They will remain a discretionary service offered by members. At the same time, the priority locates deal with things like people who don't have water. So again, there's a strong belief that while it may not be legally required, there is a strong imperative for members to not unduly inconvenience people who might be suffering from those service outages. Another important change is renegotiations. We've had a number of challenges at Ontario One Call with how members handled renegotiations. Some members renegotiated tickets without consulting or telling excavators, which was not permissible under the previous act. Other members were also automating renegotiations of tickets. Some of that was well-meaning, some of it was not necessarily well-meaning, but in any case, that issue is dealt with in Bill 93. Renegotiations must be done in writing. So if you've had informal policies or informal approaches about renegotiating tickets, now members and excavators must do that in writing. And emails would suffice for this purpose, but that is something that's a new change and something that members and excavators should be aware of. I'll pause now and ask Ian if there's any more questions on these specific operational items.
There is actually, Ben. There was just a confusion about the 60-day validity period. The question was, is it exclusive for Dedicated Locator or is it for everyone?
It's for everything.
Okay. The next question is about locate sharing. Does this mean that if a general contractor goes on site, they request a locate, they can share it with every one of their subcontractors?
So at the top of page 9 of Bill 93, you'll see what exactly is involved with sharing locate information. So the way it reads is that an excavator who submits a locate request is permitted to share with another excavator, but only if the other excavator's contact information was included in the locate request that was submitted to the corporation, or if an excavator who submitted the locate request provides the other excavator's contact information to the corporation before sharing the locate information. So obviously, if you know you're working with sub-trades who may want to use your locate information, include that in your ticket request or modify the ticket request to include that information. So it's actually pretty straightforward. As long as you know who's going to be working or who might be using your locates, just include that in the comment section of your ticket request. So it's pretty easy to operationalize. Also important to remember with sharing locate information, the person who is using your locates, your subcontractor, is still obliged to do some of the things required under the law, including looking at the written documentation and reconciling it with the marks on the ground. So if you have a party you're sharing locates with, they just can't take your word for it. They still have to look at the paper records. They still have to reconcile them with the marks on the ground. It's not not an open license to dig without doing the verification work. Every contractor and every subcontractor using that locate must repeat that action.
I have a clarification question, Ben, about the 60 days for validity. Is that business days? Is it calendar days?
It is calendar days.
Fantastic.
So with that,
yeah, you can probably move on to the next section, Ben, and we'll address some of the other questions that are coming in with our question and answer that we'll post online with the recording of this video.
Great. So the compliance process. So there's going to be a number of concepts here that'll be new to people and are definitely ones that you'll want to give a lot of thought to, whether you're a member or an excavator, because there's new things here for all of you. So let's focus about Ontario One Call's compliance process. One challenge we've had on Ontario One Call is getting the compliance model up and going. And the challenge we've had, and I'll be very frank and open here, the challenge we have is that we've created a process that was very elaborate, filled with process and procedure and an abundance of hearing and consultation and dialogue and committees. And it was almost too convoluted to get up and going. So what the government has done and what has been worked through with the Locate Solutions Working Group is a much more streamlined and common sense approach to how Ontario One Call will do compliance. If some of you work with the ESA, some of this may seem familiar because it is broadly similar to what they do. So right now we would have a very complex process where there would be notices and there'd be a compliance committee hearing, and then you could appeal to an appeals committee, which is a subset of the board. All of those concepts are gone. A new streamlined process will work as follows. Ontario One Call will appoint an assessor, which is really one of its own compliance staff, who may, by order, impose an administrative penalty against a member or excavator that has contravened the act or its regulation. So here's the new concept. Right now, it just applies to members, and that's because our compliance regime exists entirely in the bylaws of the organization, which are only binding upon the members of the corporation. What the legislation does is take compliance out of Ontario One Call's bylaws and puts it in the Ontario Underground Infrastructure Notification System Act itself. That also means any party who violates the act is subject to compliance activity. And in the act, there's a whole list of things that members must do, including providing locates, providing written records, meeting certain timelines, sharing certain information with Ontario One Call. Those are specific things members must do under the Act. And with the changes in Bill 93, they'll expand to include providing records for Dedicated Locator and things like that. All of those things, if they're not followed, are violations of the Act, and members can be subject to compliance activity and financial penalty because of those. At the same time, there are also things excavators are responsible for under the Act. That list is much shorter than what members must do, but there are things excavators must do under the Act, including ticket dumping, so not entering tickets for work beyond 30 days. Excavators must call for locates. If you're required to use Dedicated Locator and you try to use the regular system, that would also be an offense. So both members and excavators could be subject to compliance activity now, but, and this is very important to remember too, only for the specific things they're required to do under the Act. So a lot of people don't like it when, for example, an excavator selects a dig area that's too large. That's not the right thing to do. That's a bad thing to do. But it's not specifically against the law. And that means it's not subject to compliance activity from Ontario One Call. We might cancel the ticket. We might work on you in terms of how you enter tickets, but it's not an offense under the Act. The only thing that's an offense under the Act are the very specific requirements in the Act. So again, these are very specific responsibilities and specific things that members and excavators can be held account to. Practically speaking, what will happen is that the Board of Ontario One Call will basically develop a schedule of offenses and an associated penalty with each offense. And as envisioned in legislation, the Minister of Government and Consumer Services will put those policies into regulation, and that's how this section will have power. So essentially, Ontario One Call compliance people will be called assessors. They will look at an instance or a series of instances, make a determination, and apply a penalty against the member or excavator. The member or excavator may not like that. They may disagree with the conclusion, but the penalty will be applied by Ontario One Call. It does not require a hearing. So much like the ESA can have an inspector issue a penalty, One Call can have an assessor apply a penalty. That said, that's not the end of the process. If a member or excavator so chooses, they may appeal the decision of the assessor to an appeals body. That appeal body will be established by the minister through a minister regulation. It's likely to be some form of binding arbitration. So yes, a member will be able to have an independent body look and review any assessment by the assessor that they don't agree with. Same applies to an excavator. If there's a finding that an excavator, for example, dug without locates, and a penalty has been applied by the assessor, and the excavator does not agree with that action by the assessor, they will have the opportunity to go to the appeals body and have an independent review of that decision. Old bodies such as the compliance committee and the appeals committee are abolished. And as I said, both members and excavators can be penalized under the law, but only for the specific things they're obliged to do under the Act. So it's not open season on members or open season on excavators. It's very much targeted to their specific responsibilities under the Act. Let me pause there for questions. Actually, let's go to the next slide first. Because with this, there's another important change that I really want to focus on as well. One challenge and point of discussion around compliance was the phrase all reasonable attempts that existed in the current version of the Ontario Underground Infrastructure Notification System Act. There was a lot of dispute because the law required that members make quote unquote all reasonable attempts to provide locates within 5 business days. And the meaning of what all reasonable attempts really meant was very much disputed. A lot of excavators felt that that was basically carte blanche for members to basically use any excuse they could come up with to say, well, we made all reasonable attempts and thus we're not really subject to any penalty. So that was an argument that was considered by government, and certainly I know in terms of how this decision was made, stakeholders had a lot to say about this from both sides. I know there's strong opinions amongst excavators and members about how this should be treated. And I can say that the government gave both of those sides of the argument a lot of consideration and looked at those very closely. The decision that was made was to delete the phrase all reasonable attempts from the law. That means members face an absolute standard of 5 business days. So things that might be reasonable. You know, I'm looking outside today in Guelph. We had a lot of snow today. So bad weather, adverse weather might impede locate delivery. That's not an excuse anymore. There's, at a more macro level, there's issues with staffing and hiring people. It's a competitive workplace environment. Locating jobs don't necessarily pay very well. It's a challenging market to hire people. That can't be used as all reasonable attempts anymore. So all of those potential defenses or arguments are eliminated from the Act. In fact, the Act goes further than that. Bill 93 specifically excludes that type of defense. And this is one example where I quoted the Act itself. If an order imposing an administrative penalty against a member or excavator applies, even if the member or excavator took all reasonable steps to prevent the contravention on which the order is based, or at the time of the contravention, the member or excavator had an honest and reasonable belief in a mistaken set of facts that, if true, would have rendered the contravention innocent. So for both members and excavators, but primarily this is a discussion around the timely delivery of locates by members. There's a real hard line position in Bill 93 that there is an absolute standard to deliver 5 business day locates. Obviously, there are a lot of challenges with that, both in terms of the practical day-to-day nature of the work, the seasonality of the work, the challenges in hiring, recruiting, and retaining these staff. The government has considered all of those and is certainly aware of all of those. And they've taken a position here that's a very strong line. And I don't want to sugarcoat that or mislead anyone. This is a very strong line that's being taken in Bill 93. And it's something that certainly the members and also excavators need to be very mindful of. So when you're discussing Bill 93 within your own organization, this is a slide that you really need to focus on and discuss amongst all the others. This is really an important concept. So let me pause here and ask about questions about Ontario One Calls compliance.
That's great. Thank you, Ben. There's a lot of great questions coming in. Again, just to reiterate, we will post this webinar on our website, as well as we'll get as many questions answered as possible and post it on our website as well. Here's a question for you, Ben. What happens to the funds? So if there are penalties, AMAs or AMPs that Ontario One Call administers, what happens with those funds?
I believe that the ministry, I don't think it's out within the law, but I believe that the ministry will have a requirement on Ontario One Call that we have a policy describing where that money is going to be dedicated. And I think it'll be part of our MOU with the ministry. In any case, there will likely be a formal policy that will say that any funds collected will go to public education or something like that. That's certainly the view of the board. The board does not want to be in a position where fines or penalties applied to members is funding the day-to-day operations of the organization. That's not something they want to do.
Great. Another question comes down to multiple regulators. So could an excavator or a member get fined by both like the TSSA or other regulator and Ontario One Call for the same occurrence?
That's a great question. That's typically called double jeopardy. And we're going to discuss that in a moment too. In theory, the answer is yes, because they're violations of different acts. Practically speaking, what we do is the entity best able to deal with it will deal with the incident. So if there's an incident with an excavation without locates leading to a damage, that's something where One Call would leave it to the TSSA to handle because they have a greater field presence and probably better tools to deal with the situation in a more immediate and impactful way. If it's a question around chronic delivery of late locates over a period of several months, and TSSA knows about it, that's the kind of thing they would leave to Ontario One Call because One Call has the tools and the data to best deal with that. So in theory, yes. Practically speaking, no. The various entities which do talk to each other would leave it to the entity best able to deal with it.
Fantastic. The next one is just a clarification on a couple of days or dates, timelines that you had mentioned. They wanted to make sure there wasn't a contradiction in the act. There was a question about in Dedicated Locator, the time frame is supposed to be 10 business days, but for all other locates, it has to be 5 business days. Is that a contradiction, or is it well explained in the bill?
There are basically 2 different standards. Dedicated Locator is 10 business days, and that's to make it consistent with the Broadband Act, which talks about 10 business days. But everything outside of Dedicated Locator remains at 5 business days. So there's 2 standards, one for Dedicated Locator, one for everything else.
Fantastic. Another question is there anything in this new act that limits the amount of locates that a member or their LSP can accept from One Call?
Good question. And this gets to basic economics, which is supply and demand. And I've had a lot of these discussions with the ministry and at the board level as well. One of the big challenges members face is that the demand for locates is enormous. I think last year, demand was up by almost 10% year over year. Year over year so far this year, it's up 11% year over year. And members are coming to us and saying, you know, in spite of our best efforts, we're still drowning with a volume of locates that keeps on going up and up. And to be frank, and this comes from the government's point of view as well, the government's doing broadband, the government's doing major transit projects. A lot of our other members who are major utilities and municipalities, they're planning big expansions as well. So the demand is increasing well above any kind of rate of inflation. And the reality is the way our regime is set up and the way the province is going generally, that's only going to be magnified. So there's really no ability in this bill or in our current legislation to reduce or somehow mitigate the demands that excavators have for locates, just because there's so much money going into it, there's so much more money going into it, and a lot of it's now by the province. What we want to do with this bill, and this is we the industry, is increase the supply of locators. The last couple of years has really been a story of rapidly increasing demand and a limited supply of locators to meet that demand. Dedicated Locator and a lot of the concepts in Bill 93 are about creating the tools for excavators and members to create a greater supply of locators, to create more opportunity for new companies and new entities to be certified, to create new avenues for excavators to employ their own staff, and to really open the doors to new solutions. So the answer to the question is really no in terms of limiting demand, but yes in terms of increasing supply. So that's where all our heads need to turn. Our heads need to turn away from any idea that we can somehow stop construction happening in Ontario and instead turn it towards increasing the number of locators. Now, even though I say that, there are things we're doing to help on the, I guess, the demand side. Technical, in terms of technology, we've improved our platform in Ontario One Call to help reduce over notification. So members are receiving far fewer requests from outside the excavation area or excavations which don't interfere with their infrastructure. That was MSN, and that reduced notifications by about 15%. We rolled that out a few years ago. We also rolled out a new web platform earlier this year that should again make tickets clearer and more specific and narrower in terms of what they're requesting. So we are doing things to, in a very specific way, reduce demand. But generally, this whole act is about understanding that there's increasing demand for locates and matching that scenario with increased supply of locators.
Fantastic. Okay, we have a whole bunch of questions here, Ben. So just let us know how long you want to go. But there was a question about ticket dumping. You had mentioned ticket dumping, but someone was looking through the bill and trying to find that section. Can you explain what that section is or where to find it?
So let me just flip through my notes.
It's the reference requesting a locate for 30 days.
Yeah, so it's on page 9, section 12.1. An excavator shall not submit a standard locate request more than 30 days before an excavation or dig is expected to commence. So ticket dumping is when an excavator dumps in a whole bunch of tickets, literally an entire season's worth of work, understanding that not all of the work is going to start within 30 days. That happens a fair bit. It's oftentimes excavators who don't really understand the system as well as they should, or who are trying to play the system so they get as many locates as they can. And that's sort of their way of gaming the system. Dumping of locates does not include scenarios like a tree planting company putting in 1,000 requests for the next 30 days when they have resources to actually do those 1,000 requests. So ticket dumping isn't just putting a lot of tickets into the system at once. It's putting a lot of tickets into the system at once where you're not going to start them within 30 days. So that's dealt with on page 9, section 12.1.
Fantastic. Another question comes down to a lot of the materials or the changes being put forward are surrounding dedicated locator. So the question was, does that mean that the compliance changes only affect dedicated locator, or is it for all locates?
It's for all locates.
Fantastic.
So maybe we'll move to the next part.
Sorry, I'll just one more question before you go to the next part, Ben. It's a question about an excavator who plans to dig on a project, so they put in a locate request. What happens if they put in a locate request, then their project gets bumped, so it's no longer within 30 days? Does that make them non-compliant?
Well, the big advantage, and this is one of the changes in the legislation, when you have 60-day validity periods, projects that get shorter bumps shouldn't be affected as much, because if it's pushed back a couple of weeks, ideally your locates are still good for another 30 days. Those types of scenarios, those aren't really the excavator's fault if the member or the project owner, if it's a dedicated locator, has changed the request. So typically those aren't things we see as violations, because they had, they were prepared to dig, and then the member or whoever the project owner has changed it, that wouldn't really be counted against the member, or sorry, counted against the excavator.
And sorry, just one more question about the reasonable attempts, because you mentioned that the phrase reasonable attempts has been deleted. So the question is, so is the 5 business days now an absolute for compliance?
Yes.
Thank you.
So we'll go to the next slide. So we just spent, a good 20 minutes talking about Ontario One Call's compliance and the exposure that members and now excavators face from Ontario One Call. But there's also an additional process on top of that relating to members and their liability as well. So this is something separate and entirely different from the risk that Ontario One Call and its assessor will issue a penalty against you. There is recourse in the legislation. This just repeats what's in Bill 257. So this is not something new that the Ministry of Government Consumer Services created. This is a concept that exists in the Broadband Act. Compliance outside of Ontario One Call. So in theory, previous to Bill 93, if a member did not provide a locate to the excavator in a time frame as required under the law, it was conceivable that an excavator could take a member to court for damages caused by the member's inability to live up to their legal definition for 5 business day locates. That was always a possibility. Much harder in reality. One, because the law says all reasonable attempts. And also because administratively it's hard to take someone to court. It's a lengthy process. It's not really worth the time of excavators to do that. At the same time, there's a very clear reality, which is excavators face financial impacts and financial penalties because of late locates. I think we've all had many conversations with excavators about liquidated damages and how late locates impacts their productivity. And there is protection that the government essentially sought in Bill 257 to protect themselves against those financial losses. And in Bill 93, they include that as well. So this is carried over from Bill 257 specifically. So in addition, above and beyond what Ontario One Call is doing, excavators may pursue compensation for a loss or expense from members for inaccurately providing a locate. So this is actually the first time we've seen the accuracy of the locate be included in the legislation. An incorrect clearance or a late locate. And if the member and excavator can't agree on compensation, then the excavator may make a claim to the Ontario Land Tribunal, which of course is a former Ontario Municipal Board. So these are two separate things. One call can penalize you for a violation of the law. Concurrent to that, an excavator can go after a member for their demonstrated financial losses because of late locates or inaccurate locates. And that's a big step and a big change. And this law spells out how that works. There was a discussion around, should this apply to excavators? Should this work the other way? Should members be allowed to take excavators to the Ontario Land Tribunal for an excavator's failure to follow the law. So if an excavator has been ticket dumping or a, whatever other violation has been. That got some consideration, but I don't think they had enough time to consider it. But generally, and if you think of the last section where now both members and excavators are included, there is an interest in creating balance between members and excavators in the legislation. At the same time, we have to look at the reality. The reality is that late locates are the predominant non-compliance issue at Ontario One Call. And this creates a mechanism by which excavators can receive damages. There is a qualification to it. There must be a demonstrable loss or expense. You just can't have a general claim that you were inconvenienced or you incurred costs because of the late locate. You actually need to quantify and demonstrate that. At the same time, we all know about the impact of liquidated damages. Those are well documented. Those are the exact types of things that would be eligible for this OLT process. So let me pause if you have any questions on that.
Hi, Ben. Yes, we got some questions here. So just to clarify, are you saying that a member, a locator, and an excavator has legal rights within this bill, and they could use the OLT?
So if you go to section 16, which is on the bottom of page 9, it describes a process that is very limited. So a member shall compensate an excavator for a loss or expense incurred because the member did these things. So while the Ontario One Call compliance has essentially equality between members and excavators, and they can both be penalized by Ontario One Call, this is a one-way road. This is about members compensating excavators. It doesn't work the other way around. There was a discussion about whether it should work the other way around, but that wasn't concluded. So as of now, it is just a one-way road in terms of this provision.
Sounds great. And on the same line of questions, it was if you're not a party that is excavating, but say you're responsible for locating and relocating, would the Ontario Land Tribunal be a place for a member to take another member for losses?
No.
Okay.
The law as written is limited to an excavator taking a member. Those are all good questions, and in theory, it could be considered that it should be reciprocal for everyone, that members could take excavators and excavators could take members, but that idea was brought forward. I don't think it had enough time to be considered for it, so.
Fantastic. There isn't too many questions about the Ontario Land Tribunal that I'm seeing in here, but there's quite a bit of questions on compliance. Do you want me just to ask a couple of those questions, so that's okay?
Sure.
There's a question about refusal of using a third-party dedicated locator. So say there's an arrangement by everyone except one member, and they don't want to use that dedicated locator. They would rather use someone else that they trust. Is that acceptable, or is that a compliance issue?
That is a compliance issue.
Okay.
And practically speaking, and this is something we've discussed even at the board level, it's important that members and project owners, of course, project owners are typically members, and excavators work together to develop, and this is why we talked about the supply of locators. It's important that everyone work together to increase that supply of locators. There may be instances where there's a good reason. If a potential dedicated locator has had performance issues in the past, that might be a good reason. But generally speaking, a member cannot unreasonably withhold permission for a dedicated locator. And that should just give us more impetus to say that, well, we better develop standardized criteria, and we should make it as easy as possible for members to certify these people. That's one thing the Dedicated Locator Working Committee will be doing.
There's a couple questions in here about private locators.
Yep.
Does this section, or even any of the compliance section, affect the work that private locators do?
No, but it does open up the door for them to be utilized in dedicated locator projects. It sort of expands the range of projects they can work on as well.
There was a comment around renegotiated. You brought up renegotiated on a previous slide, and how that might be changing in the Act. There was a question around how sometimes renegotiated dates are put in that someone didn't agree to. Does this Act solve that issue?
Yes, this Act specifically requires that such renegotiations be done in writing. So not only does the other person have to, I know a lot of people just do it over the phone, but it needs to be specifically documented now. So if a member wants, or an LSP wants a different negotiation date, they have to produce documentation. Even if it's just an email, they have to produce documentation that the other party has agreed to it.
There's a lot of questions around the penalties and how much they will be. Is there a maximum or a minimum amount for non-compliance in this Act?
There is. The Act specifies a limit of $10,000, and that's the maximum penalty. And the One Call Board's been looking at drafts of various policies. Some offenses would be as low as $250 or $500. Others will go up to a maximum of $10,000. There's no view that we should have a regime where you get fined $10,000 for every late locate and then you get a $10 million fine. That's not anyone's intent or desire. So it's fair to say that the maximum penalty would be $10,000.
I'm receiving a lot of questions around the 60-day validity period for members, confusion on both sides. Just wondering if you could help explain that if someone provides a locate and it's valid for 60 days, but the project continues on past that 60 days, are they still allowed to get a relocate?
Yes.
Okay. And then the next one is 60-day validity period, which is now mandatory for all members to have. Is that just a minimum? Is there a maximum they're allowed to have, or does everyone have to be stuck at 60 days?
It's a 60-day minimum. So if you're a member who basically allows for 90-day locates or 180-day locates or for the life of the project, that's fine. You can go ahead and do that still.
There was a question about the difference between an offense and a fine. Is that different in the Act?
Yeah, again, I'll defer to the Act in terms of this legislation. There's very specific wording about the various verbs and nouns that the assessor uses. So I'd urge people to look at the actual Act, because sometimes people will use, and even I will use, phrases like penalties and administrative amounts sort of interchangeably. But look to the legislation and the section on compliance and the assessor. Those will be the very specific phrases. And when you talk to your lawyers, they'll be interested in the very specific phrases as well.
There's been some concerned questions about absolute liability. Now, the question comes up that in the past, Ontario One Call has promoted compliance to be worked out between the members and excavators to work together to come up with solutions. Is that this Act trying to get away from that with the absolute liability, or is it still encouraged for them to work together to solve the locates being late?
I would say it doesn't change anything. It's still imperative that members and excavators work together. I think what this legislation does, and I think this is most keenly felt around dedicated locator, I think this legislation actually makes it more important that they work together, because the real solution, to be frank, the real solution isn't finding more members or creating higher standards and more risks for members or including excavators in compliance. None of those things solve the problem in itself. What will solve the problems we face with late locates is increasing the number of locators. And especially with dedicated locator and how open Bill 93 makes it, there's going to be a lot of excavators, and I'm sure all the excavators in this call are thinking in their own heads about, can we start our own locating company? Can I get my own employees certified? Those are very true things, and I encourage you to think like that. At the same time, members can be thinking, how can I help new market entrants come in and do locates? How can I help excavators or excavator associations become certified to do locates? There's a lot of common ground there where excavators and members can work together to certify, develop, encourage, and train new staff. So cooperation, I think, is more essential than ever. And I think the ground for that cooperation is going to be around increasing the supply of locators.
There's a couple of questions surrounding locators themselves. There was a comment about now that they are defined in the Act. What does that mean? Does that mean that there can be direct enforcement from Ontario One Call against a locator or an LSP instead of the member?
No, not really. It's still this is still a regime fundamentally of members and excavators. The one change Bill 93 brings is the idea of a project owner. And with Dedicated Locator, there's a new relationship between the project owner and the LSP. So the locator isn't really going to end up in Ontario One Call compliance. The risk of the LSP exists with Dedicated Locator contracts and their employers, who are the project owners. But again, that's a contractual arrangement. That's not really a compliance exposure that LSPs face. So, and again, it's really up to LSPs to determine what kind of contracts they want to enter for Dedicated Locator, how penalties would work under that. But that's a business contract between two parties.
And then there was a question, another question surrounding LSPs. Now that the Ontario Land Tribunal has opened up that possibility for excavators to get compensation, is there any avenues for LSPs or members to go after excavators?
That was something we talked about. We had some, I think, good discussions amongst the stakeholders in the government about that. I think it was an interesting discussion to have because there is an argument in favor of that in terms of, let's put members and excavators on equal footing with equal rights and equal responsibilities. That's partially been achieved in terms of them both being subject to Ontario One Call compliance. But I think, to be frank, it kind of ran out of time in terms of considering it for the OLT process. Maybe that's something we could revisit in the future. But as of now, Bill 93 just has it set up for excavators to take members to the OLT.
And then there's some questions around design and planning. Questions are, is design and planning included in this? Is it now law that all members have to participate or share records for design and planning? Or is that only for Dedicated Locator?
Yeah, there's nothing in the bill about design and planning other than having to submit information 90 days in advance for Dedicated Locator. And even then, and this is something the working committee will work out, the information that the project owners will provide doesn't necessarily have to be design and planning level or subsurface utility engineering type of information. It just needs to be sufficient information for the Dedicated Locator to understand the location of the work and how many people they'll need to do the work. So the working committee will actually develop the standard, but nothing in the legislation really gets to the idea of planning or design or improving that process. That's still something the operations committee at One Call is looking at.
Fantastic. Another question, compliance question around a project owner that has a project that's designated for Dedicated Locator. The question is, why would a project owner pay for a Dedicated Locator when it's already in the law that it's supposed to be free within 5 business days?
That's not what the law says. The law does not promise anyone free locates. Free locates are provided as a courtesy by members, and there's historical reasons for that. But the only thing that's free under the law is making a request to Ontario One Call. Locates are not free. Members could turn around today and say, we're going to charge 100% of all the costs to our locates to everyone, including homeowners and landscapers. There is no guarantee or no assurance that locates are free.
Fantastic. There was a question with the penalties, right? So if there is a financial penalty put towards someone, just about is it a fine? Is it an offense, or is it a fee?
That's a great question. I would urge people to look at the act because I often misspeak and misstate that. Sometimes I say fine, sometimes I say penalty. I think the government uses the phrase AMA, administrative monetary amount, but I'd urge everyone, if they're interested in that level of detail, look at the law and there'll be the exact wording in there. And I put the actual sections throughout the presentation just so you can look those up quickly. But I'm sure I'll give you the wrong answer on that, so I'll urge you to look up the right answer.
There's a concern in here. Just it's come up a couple times, so I thought that I'd bring this question to you, Ben. That if this gets passed in, say, a month's time, and some of the topics you're talking about, like dedicated locator, there's a working group trying to build standards. How does someone stay in compliance if the standards aren't generated yet?
Yeah, I think certainly the people on the locate or the dedicated locator working committee will feel that way. I also don't think we'll get people coming. Obviously, IO will be part of that working committee, will be very involved, but I don't think you'll see things change overnight. And I think some of the early movers, IO is obviously going to be one of the early movers. I know I've been approached by other excavator interests about them wanting to be early movers. So I think the companies that'll be early movers will understand that we're still figuring out some of the policies and procedures. And I would actually encourage them, with that being the case, I would encourage them to come forward and help the committee work through some of those things. I know I have excavators who've already identified third parties to do locates. We want to work with them and talk with them about how we can make that certification process works. So to the extent that there's excavators on this call who are interested and already have ideas spinning, I'm sure the working committee and the membership as a whole are excited to work with you, knowing that we'll have to work out the kinks in the first year, but I think we all want to work together to develop really good policies and procedures. I don't think there's going to be a magic solution from day one, but I do think there'll be a lot of goodwill between everyone to answer those questions, which I'm sure we all have.
Great. And just a couple more questions about dedicated locator and how it revolves around compliance. Who gets penalized for a late locate with a dedicated locator? Is it each individual utility member, or is it the contracted dedicated locator?
So in theory, and this is something we've discussed too, and the legislation doesn't really talk about this because it's really a private contract between the project owner and the designated locator. What should really happen is that the designated locator's contract with the project owner will specify what are the penalties for not meeting the service standard. That's something that should be dealt with as part of the contract between those two parties. When you think about it, it doesn't actually affect anyone outside of those two parties because the project owner is the one funding the project and is responsible and suffers any consequence of late locates. The dedicated locator is one receiving payment for this service. And the members who've done everything they need to do under the Act, they've signed up with the designated locator, they've provided all the records, they've empowered the dedicated locator to do everything they need. In that case, the member has done everything they need to do. It's really the dedicated locator who's dropping the ball. So it's not going to be the member who's penalized for the dedicated locator when the member has already discharged everything they have to do under the law. It's really a dispute between the project owner and the DL.
Along the same line, but this also with the general pool of locates as well, if a locator or a member is having problems actually finding their plant, right? Removing all reasonable attempts, does that mean that they're non-compliant if they don't hit the timelines?
Correct.
Okay.
And to be frank, those instances do happen, and there is some infrastructure because of outdated records or difficult to locate. There's some because of they're not intrinsically locatable because of the materials they're made out of or how they were installed. Those problems existed before Bill 93. They'll exist after Bill 93. And it's still important that members take the responsibility for locating their infrastructure, even when it's hard to locate, and maybe especially if it's hard to locate. Because if the member's struggling to find it, it's unlikely the excavator is going to be able to avoid it.
And then another question about dedicated locator in terms of compliance. Could dedicated locators be used for emergencies?
Possibly. I don't see what would, in that case, it would just be regular LSPs. So I don't see why that would be a problem.
Great. And then there's a question about liability for one call in terms of compliance.
Okay.
Is that, actually, I believe that's your next slides anyway.
Yeah, we're going to talk, we may as well skip forward ahead and talk about one call's governance. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because it doesn't really affect, or it doesn't affect the day-to-day lives of most people on this phone call. There are a lot of changes in Bill 93 to our governance at Ontario One Call. Some of that deals with liability, and a lot of the language that exists with some of the other designated administrative authorities like TSSA and ESA are replicated in our act. So the minister, for example, has more tools to penalize Ontario One Call if Ontario One Call is not executing its responsibilities under the act. Some things that touch more on what members might see, for example, at the AGM, the minister may make additional appointments to the board, they change the makeup of the board as long as they don't appoint a majority of the board. That's similar to the ministerial powers for other entities. We currently have an MOU with One Call in the government that's voluntary. It will now become mandatory and more like DAAs, and there's going to be more requirements upon Ontario One Call because of that. And the objects of the corporation are expanded. The objects are important too because that's part of the act right at the front, and that really describes the job and role of Ontario One Call. Currently, the job of Ontario One Call is literally run the call center, notify people of locates, and engage in public education. That's pretty much the entirety of our legal mandate. Our objects under Bill 93 would be expanded to include compliance and enforcement, activity which supports timely response to locate requests, and activities in accordance with the MOU, which is basically a lot of reporting and disclosures on our website for the most part. So in addition to running the call center and public education, those three things would be added to our must-do list as an organization. So that'll influence some of our business planning and some of our strategic planning because those are things we must deliver on by law. On the next slide, we talk about the Dedicated Locator Working Committee, and I won't stop on this slide because we've talked about it a bit already. So this committee is going to start meeting as of next Thursday, and it's going to have a number of tasks. The first two tasks will be when a project owner provides 90-day notice, what does that notice look like? What's the form of that notice? And what level of detail and information does it need to provide? So if IO has to provide 90 days notice on July 1st, 2022 for the next 90 or 180 days, what do they need to tell us? Like, do they have to give us planning records? Do they have to give us municipal addresses? Probably not. But they have to give us enough information that a locate service provider could evaluate the resourcing, the timing, and the location of the staffing they need. So that's one type of project the committee will work on. They'll also work on something that's come up a number of times already, which is what's the standard certification that can be developed so that One Call members can easily adapt and approve new dedicated locators. There's a lot of work already done through things like the Locate Alliance Consortium and other outsourcing contracts. So this committee will be tasked with the job of creating basically a universal template that a member of any size or any industry can quickly adapt to say, these are our requirements, these are our standards, this is what you have to do for QA and insurance and training, and we can easily use this. And the various dedicated locator entities that move forward can get similarity when they're doing work with different members in different parts of the province. So creating that standardized certification standard will be one of the tasks. Obviously, they'll work on more things as things come forward. I can think of some already. I know people on this call can think of some already, but that's where they're going to start, and they'll continue to work throughout the spring building out those processes. And at one call, they'll be supported by Adam Morden and his member services team. We're actually going to have a unit within Ontario One Call specifically assigned to dedicated locators. So there'll be a dedicated locator project lead, there'll be dedicated locator coordinators. So people involved with dedicated locator, whether you're a member, project owner, excavator, LSP, you'll have a dedicated team to take care of those projects for you. On the next slide, we're just in our last 15 minutes or so, and I'm going to quickly touch upon the implications before getting to next steps, and maybe just ending with some open Q&A. So this is mostly my qualitative assessment about what everyone should be thinking about and how, where they should put their mind. Obviously, there's a ton of stuff in Bill 93. I imagine all your minds are spinning with dedicated locator and some of the other operational changes and some of the changes around compliance. There's probably a lot of, things spinning through your head. So I want to lay out some thoughts about implications and where we should be putting our attention and focus. So just speaking to the members, and I think I mentioned this earlier, there's a real opportunity to work with project owners, which in often cases yourself, and excavators to supply, to increase the supply and diversity of locating resources in Ontario. We suffer from, above all, a lack of locators. Demand's an issue, but the biggest issue is the supply of people to do the work. Even if you're willing to pay far above the odds, there's just not people to do locating work. And it's hard to train, recruit, and retain people as well. So dedicated locator, and I think Bill 93 in general, really opens the door for everyone to work together to increase supply. Obviously, there are significant changes to the risk profile of late locates, and members must understand these changes. So this presentation will be public. Certainly, there's other material out there about Bill 93. Talk to people in your organization. I know a lot of people who are frontline people, they're focused on the day-to-day management. It's important that you go within your organization and talk to senior management, to talk to legal counsel, and to really get your organization prepared and to get their heads around what's in Bill 93. It does have big implications. Of course, members are project owners too. You have a new role to play. The working committee will talk to members and project owners about what that new role is. But even within your own organization, I know a lot of you will be focused on the delivery of locate side, and the construction side might be a separate unit in a separate part of a different building. But it's important that you talk to each other too, because this is a big change. And as some people point out, in a world with a lot of dedicated locator usage, a lot of members will see their operating and maintenance costs go down because now project proponents are paying for their own work. But in terms of your own capital work, your costs may go up because now you're paying for your own locates. So in a lot of respects, there's going to be a shifting of costs within the industry from O&M to capital. And my background, which is regulated utilities, that's actually a very desirable thing. You make money off the money that you put into the ground, that you spend in capital. You don't make any money off O&M. That's just a cost that you may as well burn in the parking lot. So right off the bat, there's an important regulatory thing to consider, which is there is an obvious shifting of costs from O&M to capital. And that has some bottom line financial impacts as well. For excavators, just as I was saying that members have a role to play in increasing the supply of locators, excavators now have greater tools to take control of their own locate's destiny. If you're an excavator, you should be thinking, how can I form my own locating company? Can I train my own locators within my own company who are my current staff? Should I hire people and train them as locators so that I can control locates as opposed to relying on other parties to deliver locates? How can I eliminate that external risk of relying on other people for locators? And in doing so, you and the members are really working together to increase the supply of locators. So the door is really open for you to pursue developing those new resources. And Bill 93 tears down a lot of barriers which could exist. Members can't really say no to dedicated locator, so the door is really open. Excavators have new tools to recover economic losses due to members' non-compliance. As I said before, you have to demonstrate the economic impacts, but if you can, you do have that option. However, excavators have greater accountability under the law and could be subject to penalties from Ontario One Call. Again, that's just for the limited and very specific things you're required to do under the Act, but that liability does exist there. And getting on to next steps, and after this, we'll go into general Q&As for the last few minutes. So we'll talk about some of the timing for Bill 93. Bill 93 has already been introduced, which constitutes first reading. So it was introduced on Monday. Second reading constitutes a number of days of debate in the Ontario legislature. That's what you see when you flip through the channels and stop on the legislative channel. Second reading has already started. They did their first day of debate yesterday. It'll likely have a few more days of debate spread out over the next week or two. And after that, unless the government decides to time allocate it, it'll likely go to committee around the end of the month. That's not guaranteed. There's still more debate and more decisions to happen. But if it does go to committee, that would happen around the end of the month. If it were to go to committee, there would be the opportunity for people to make presentations. So if there are items you support or don't support about Bill 93, there may be the opportunity at the end of the month to make a presentation before a standing committee of the Ontario legislature to have your say. And you can do that if you're a private company, a private individual, an industry association. You can all apply to make a presentation before the committee. There's also the opportunity, once those presentations are done, for the members of that committee to consider clause by clause amendments. So if it does go to committee, there is still the opportunity to make changes to the bill. And again, this will take place in the next couple of weeks. So time is of the essence. So in terms of how quickly you should be doing things, if you need to talk to people within your own organization, you should talk to them literally today. If you want to provide written feedback, and one of the first slides talks about where to submit that feedback, you should be doing it no later than next week. And if you want to present to the standing committee or offer amendments, you should be preparing that work in the next week or two, because by the next week or two, it'll likely be done second reading. So again, time is of the essence. After it goes to committee, it goes back to the legislature for third reading, which tends to be much briefer. And then it comes up to a vote in the House. That would be third reading. And then royal assent is where the lieutenant governor signs off on it. That's a pro forma step. It'll take place probably a couple days later. So as I've talked about, this could likely become law within the next month or so. Things will move very quickly. And if you and your organization want to have a say, you pretty much have to take action right away. And of course, there's still a lot of things from the Locate Solutions working group that are still outstanding. Some of them are things that could have been in the bill, but fell off for one reason or the other. There's also things that are generally operational in nature. So the ops committee will have a lot of work to do as well to follow through on what came out of the Locate Solutions working group. And of course, at the same time, the Designated Locator working group, they'll be pushing forward on those specific policies and procedures as well. So I'll end it there. We have about 10 minutes left for some general Q&A. So I'll leave that to Ian to pick out some questions.
Sounds great, Ben. I'll do this in rapid fire. There's quite a bit of questions coming in, and we'll do our best to answer them online afterwards. And just to your point, Ben, about doing feedback and the link that you had on the second slide, this presentation or this deck is posted on our website currently, and it is a clickable link where you can provide feedback. So just a quick question about, is it ever possible for a member to refuse doing a locate? And here's the scenario. Say they decide to charge for a locate and someone doesn't pay them, can they refuse providing a locate?
No. In that case, if you want to be paid for a locate and the excavator won't pay, you would have to take it to small claims court. In Bill 93, and this is talking about dedicated locators specifically, the law makes it very clear that a project owner must pay for the dedicated locator. So if you're the project owner, you cannot dodge that charge in any respect.
And on the same lines, but refusal for dedicated locator, can a member refuse dedicated locator because they have a union agreement?
No.
I apologize.
Whether you,
I talked over you there.
no, it's fine because I gave a very quick answer. The provincial law supersedes any union agreement or contractual arrangement that you might have.
There's been a couple questions about mapping. So what if a utility does not have good mapping and they have to share to the dedicated locator?
So if you're a member who has poor mapping, you have the same problem today as you would in the future with dedicated locator, which is it's hard to locate your infrastructure unless you're using your own staff who somehow have knowledge that allows them to understand it. Like literally there's members who have staff who've been there 40 years and they rely on the institutional knowledge of people who've been there 40 years to do it. And I have to caution the strongest terms against that because quite frankly, what happens when that guy retires? All the institutional knowledge disappears. And whether it's you doing the locates with the new staff you've hired or a dedicated locator doing it, your entire process fails. So what you need to do, quite frankly, is spend the time and money. And I do know budgets are strained and funding is not unlimited. But if you're in that situation, regardless of dedicated locator or not, you need to spend the money to improve the mapping so people in the future can do the locates.
There's another question about mapping, Ben, but when it comes down to competitive industries through dedicated locator, so if it's a broadband company and they're forced to share mapping, you know, they're concerned about the competitiveness that now their competitors will know their mapping. Is there anything to deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, if a member, and this is probably something that'll be dealt with in the contracts, the standardized contract that the working committee will put together for dedicated locator, they'll likely be, because when you think about it, if you have a telecom, let's just use telecom as an example. If a telecom is sharing information with a dedicated locator, and let's say that dedicated locator also does work for one of its competitors, there'll likely be language in that contract to prevent the sharing of that mapping outside of the specific usage of it. And there'll be IT limitations on how it can be used too. So I imagine that commercially sensitive information, that will be dealt with in the standardized agreement. Because that's a problem right now with existing outsources. There's instances where competitors do share the same locate. And in theory, you know, maybe they could have access to each other's mapping through a joint intermediary, but that'll be dealt with in the contracts.
There's some questions around the corporation having to provide information on members' performance. Could you explain that a little more?
So this is something that I've discussed with the ministry and we're working on solutions towards. Generally speaking, the law is actually pretty specific. This is in terms of Bill 93. We do have to share member performance data online. What that looks like is still to be determined. In theory, we could do a report for every member every month, but that would be 10,000 reports a year. We have 800 members times 12 months. So obviously we're not going to do that because that would just be a huge administrative burden and absolutely useless for people trying to analyze things. So we're going to work with the ministry to figure out what's a practical and useful way to do that and to fulfill the requirements of the law. Generally speaking, though, members should be prepared to have their locate delivery performance disclosed, whether it's in great detail or somewhat less great detail. That's something the law requires. It's the same with outcomes of compliance activity. You should expect to have that disclosed as well.
There's a question around if someone wants to make a presentation or to provide feedback, is there a deadline?
I think there was a date of April 9th, if I remember correctly, to the regulatory registry. That's a standard deadline for the regulatory registry. I would strongly urge you to provide feedback sooner than that, just because by April 9th, I imagine the bill will be passed. So I would say within the next week, put in that feedback. And I know that might involve the late, Friday afternoon emails to the lawyers or your government relations people or your senior management, but I would say that's the appropriate level of urgency if you want to have your say on Bill 93.
If another question about dedicated locator, do utilities have to approve the dedicated locator? Is that law? And what happens if they don't approve the dedicated locator, but the locator is chosen by the rest of the group, I guess?
That's a good question. The law says that you must agree, but obviously you must collectively agree. So this is one area where there's really the opportunity for the members to work together to identify resources to be used as dedicated locators and to help encourage new people to come into the field and provide dedicated locator services. Generally speaking, if a dedicated locator has been identified by a number of members and one of them doesn't want to use it, but cannot provide a justifiable explanation other than we don't want to, that member would be subject to compliance activity from Ontario One Call. If that member had a concern that was very specific and justifiable, such as they've damaged our plant before or they failed previous QA work, that might be allowable. But generally speaking, it's not going to be an option for members just to decline it because they feel like it. They're going to have to play a